All right, joining me now is Robert Anderson, former executive assistant director of the FBI's National Security Branch. She is now CEO at Cyber Defense Labs. Also with us is Clint Watts, former FBI special agent and MSNBC national security analyst. He's also the author of Messing with the Enemy, Surviving in a Social Media World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News, because it seems like that's very much our world right now, especially after watching yesterday's testimony. Robert, I'm going to start with you on this one. Just before Mueller's testimony yesterday, Chris Wray made this point on Russian interference. Watch this.
Are the Russians still trying to interfere in our election system?
The Russians are absolutely intent on trying to interfere with our elections through,
Is it fair to say that
foreign influence in particular.
Everything we've done against Russia has not deterred them enough? All the sanctions, all the talk, they're still at it.
Well, my view is until they stop, they haven't been deterred enough.
And they're still doing it.
Yes.
So, Robert, my question here is do we have the capacity? Does the United States government have the capacity to actually stop them? Do they have the ability?
Well, we do. I think it's a great question. But what people need to realize, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, or other countries, their number one intelligence priority in every organization that they own that collects intelligence is the United States. So they are literally throwing the weight of their country against us. And I think what we really need is to be talking a joint unified message, not just from the United States, but other countries like ours that are telling them that there needs to be international cyber norms. You can't just randomly attack and try to influence political elections like they're doing. Russia's not going to stop. I would equate them to a bully on a playground, and they don't understand the words yes or please or thank you. And their intelligence services, quite frankly, are some of the best in the world. So it's a significant challenge.
Well, and considering the fact that they've kicked up so much dirt, really, over the last 2 years in this country, it doesn't necessarily seem like there's much incentive for Russia to stop at that. Clint, Wray also talked earlier today, basically emphasizing this ongoing threat that Bob Mueller touched on in his second part of his testimony from yesterday. But he particularly talked about the cyber tools that these countries now have access to.
That's right.
Let's take a listen to that.
In the last few years, we've seen many examples of cyber actors targeting political campaigns to glean intelligence and directing bots to propagate divisive messaging. We've also seen examples of actors targeting election infrastructure to obtain PII, exact ransoms, temporarily disrupt election operations, and undermine voter confidence in the electoral process. We expect much of the same in 2020. We have yet, happily, to see attacks manipulating or deleting election and voter-related data, or attacks that actually take election management systems offline. But we know that our adversaries are relentless. So are we.
So let's talk about some of these tools that these other countries, let's say the Russian, possibly the Chinese, the Iranians, whoever you want to choose and pick on any day, have access to now. But then also there's another part of this that really struck me. And he said, we have yet happily to see attacks manipulating or deleting election and voter-related data, or attacks that actually take election management systems offline. Is that the next step for many of these countries, where they are manipulating elections to the point where the numbers are being affected, where election voter data is being affected?
Yes, and I always point to Ukraine. Ukraine is a great place to look at anything Russia tries out in cyberspace. They tend to do it there first, and they expand it. So when I was watching Influence with my team 5 years ago, they had actually tried it out for many years in Ukraine before, Crimea, around those battlefields. But they had also changed votes. They had actually tested that out. They had changed votes, and the Ukrainians caught it in time. So this shows they have the ability to do it. It's just more when and where will they decide to do it, and will they march it forward? I'm sure that's what Director Wray was talking about. We've been lucky we haven't seen it here in the States, but Russia's not the only actor out there. There's many that are out there. And some of these cyber tools, the weird thing about cyberspace is when someone uses a weapon and they use it in cyberspace, they're actually giving that weapon away. That means once it's detected, let's say it's used, that weapon can then be acquired and reused in many other places. And the private sector is a big
So they're
portion.
constantly creating new weapons.
Constantly creating new weapons, and once a weapon is
fill those
deployed into the
holes.
wild,
Right.
everybody can gain access to that weapon and then use it. So it escalates the cyber battlefield. The other part that we don't talk enough about is really the private sector. I mean, we've seen consistently where there are private sector companies that are developing surveillance tools, developing hacking tools that are being sold or used or bought by either companies or other nation states. And this is really the development, I think, since 2016 we need to be looking at.
I just quickly want you to touch on this. Do you think the hearing yesterday properly acknowledged the breadth and the significance and the depth of Russian interference in our elections in 2016?
No, it was a disaster. The hearings yesterday should have been part one of the Mueller report first and part two second. This started with Russian interference. That's where it should have began. We didn't hardly discuss it at all. It wasn't until really the last hour of the hearing where we even talked about WikiLeaks and should a political campaign or should a candidate be interacting or talking positively about someone who's dumping criminal stolen information out there. We never really talked about the social media campaign at all. We didn't talk about communications, unwitting communications. How do we avoid that in the future so that campaigns, we've got 20 of them out there now, aren't actually playing into the hands of a foreign adversary to subvert our democracy.
Yeah, so we're actually going to be talking later in the show about ways in which we can stop this, especially when it comes to Facebook and that $5 billion settlement that they just had on them.